Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ed Hand, your host for tonight's Unpublished TV panel discussion. Our topic tonight is when should the Canada-U.S. border reopen to non-essential travel? However you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you that you can cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP and tell them why. Our question this week is, when will you feel comfortable reopening the Canada-U.S. border to non-essential travel? Now, when we did our podcast, it was to be revisited by today, and now the border will stay closed until October 21st, and then it will be revisited again. At unpublished.vote, you will find our podcast on this issue, as well as articles, opinion pieces, and research on the various views on reopening the border. So let's get it started. Joining us tonight, Colin Robertson's a former Canadian diplomat and vice president and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Mary Scotty Greenwood's the CEO of the Canadian American Business Association. And Jack Jedwab is the president and CEO of the Association of Canadian Studies. And our question, when will you feel comfortable reopening the Canada-U.S. border to non-essential travel? And when you looked at our choices on the poll, after 3 months, 36.1%. 6 months, 8.3%. 12 months, 22.2%. Longer than 12 months, 25%. And undecided, 8.3%. Now, the thing I find interesting about this, Colin, is the least and the most the border would be closed are the ones that are the most popular. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me the Canadians aren't ready to open the border just yet. My sense is we're probably not going to open it until it appears that both countries have the pandemic under some kind of control, and there's no sign that we're near that. And so I think realistically, the border may not reopen until there's a freely available vaccine on both sides of the border.
So you think it's going to be the vaccine? Scotty, border towns and in cities, what impact are you seeing in the U.S. on them right now?
It's a pretty difficult situation for the border towns. In the summer, whether you're in Vermont or in Fort Erie, Crystal Beach, and in Fort Erie, Ontario, you're used to having summer people, and summer people come across on their boats, come across by land, and the border communities are used to having this kind of travel and commerce that happens back and forth because the locals don't eat out at restaurants every night of the week, and they don't spend the way visitors do, and just grocery stores in Newport, Vermont are used to having folks from Magog, Quebec come down. So it's pretty challenging for the people that live along the border. The other thing, Ed, is I had a call today from a United States Senator's office. One of her constituents, was trying to just check on his property in the Maritimes and can't do that. And we see the same is true in the Pacific Northwest, Canadians coming down wanting to check on their property. So it's a pretty challenging situation along the border. And this is just a preview of the challenges that we'll have with the snowbirds, which are a little further from the border, but also an important cross-border constituency. And I would say it's not just non-essential casual travelers, but business travel that is essential for the business is also having some trouble. So it's pretty challenging.
What are Americans saying about the border? Do they want it open? Do they want it closed? We know President Trump wants it open, but what do Americans say?
Sorry, go ahead, Scotty.
No, go ahead, Jack.
Well, what I gather from the polling that we've conducted, and we're doing sort of weekly tracking polls with a company called Leger Marketing, Americans are more at ease with coming across to our side of the border than Canadians are going to the U.S. side of the border. So still not in the majority, and there's still a fair bit of uneasiness amongst Americans in terms of what the polling's suggesting, but not at the same level as the uneasiness on this side of the border about traveling to the United States.
Now, that poll you commissioned shows an overwhelming majority of Canadians want it to stay closed. Now, as the Prime Minister or the leader, how do you convince Canadians who overwhelmingly don't want it open, who say, we're going to have to open it? How do you convince them? Or is it political suicide?
Yeah, I don't think you can convince Canadians at this point that the border can be reopened without paying some political price. The government, I don't think, is near an election at this point, even though it is a minority government. I am not of the opinion that the opposition parties would want to trigger an election at this time, but I don't see why Prime Minister Trudeau would take a contrary position. When I look at the polling, which we have broken down by party preference, the percentage of people that say they are liberal, identify as liberal, that would want the border open is practically in fractions, right? It barely hits 5%. So I don't think there's any uptake amongst Prime Minister Trudeau's constituency for opening the border at this particular time. I think it really is a wait and see issue. And as Colin indicated, we might have to wait till there's a vaccine. And I don't think that's in the immediate future. It's I would suggest it's, at best in spring 2021. That's at best, despite the U.S. president suggesting that right after he gets elected, there may be a vaccine days in the mix there. So,
Colin,
and I would just add to that
sure.
The premiers. It's not just the prime minister, who I don't think has any great inclination, but you've got the three biggest premiers. Premier Horgan, who's now into an election, Premier Ford and Premier Legault. All of them want to keep the border closed as well, and city mayors, the bigger city mayors. So I think there, and as Jack points out in his other polling that both he's done, Leger, and I've seen Abacus and others, there's broad public support for keeping, at least on the Canadian side, for keeping that border closed. I think if you really want to get across, and I've had several friends who really want to get across, they've all been able to do it. Americans coming up, I think it's more difficult. And I think that's the way it unfortunately is going to remain, because what I'm struck by is that there's no, you mentioned you've did a podcast that got a lot of listeners, but I'm struck that there's no great pressure to open that from any of the sort of communities I see, business or otherwise. Scotty may have a view on this.
Now, what do you think, Scotty?
Well, I think the way you get comfortable with reopening the border, or with resuming any semblance of life the way it was before, is with testing and contact tracing. If you can prove that you don't have COVID, and we talked before about the idea of this double negative test. So you test before you go, within call it 48 hours. You test when you arrive. If both of those are negative, not sure why you would keep somebody like that out, and not sure why you'd want them to quarantine. The trick is, though, what if you test negative on your way leaving the United States going into Canada, and then you get to Canada, let's say you've landed on a plane and you get a positive result, then there's a whole protocol that would have to be worked out about how do you send that person home? What do you do with them once they've tested positive? And that's something to work out. But by the way, this isn't just about the Canada-US border. As I understand it, Canada isn't open to anyone right now. So the U.S. impact is obviously we're right here, and Canadians and Americans are used to, in the millions, going back and forth with complete ease. But this isn't. I don't think this is just directed at the U.S. I think generally Canada is taking a conservative approach for health reasons, and I think that's understandable. The way you deal with that has got to be through testing and contact tracing, because just staying closed and hermetically sealed, I don't think is a solution that's going to work in the long term.
No, it's definitely not a long-term solution. Colin, President Trump does want to reopen. How do you deal with your largest trading partner if you don't want to open?
Well, I think, again, there aren't direct conversations between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Trump on this. I think Mr. Trudeau, this is not a conversation he wants to have, but certainly I also sense that the Canadian Border Service people and the Department of Homeland Security people, they're quite content to keep it the way it is. So Trump may be going in one direction. My sense is, and again, Scotty can talk to this, is that certainly from the people I talk to on the Canadian side and some at the American Embassy, that there's not a lot of pressure from either side, at least at the bureaucratic or ministerial level, to move on this one for now, until we really have got this thing under control, because I think both sides correctly see the huge political downside. As Scotty said, the contact tracing is not perfect. And so I think until we get to that situation, and the other point is, it's not as though we are lacking, as I understand it, on either side of the border. There have been some supply chain interruptions, but not nearly at the scale that one might have thought could be the case. Some of the servicing side I know is not getting done as quickly as people would like, but generally, you go to your stores, your groceries are reasonably full, things are working, and you don't hear a lot of complaints.
Well, if I could just say, we just had our third quarter Canadian American Business Council board meeting last week, and we had a senior official from the government of Canada as part of the discussion, and almost every board member raised the issue of the challenges with the border closing for business. So it's not as transparent or obvious as it could be to get deemed essential. The quarantine requirement is effectively a ban, and so you may not be hearing a lot about it in the public domain, but in the dialogues that I'm privy to, there's a really serious concern about people being able to conduct business back and forth across the border. So I think it's something that we're going to have to deal with. Obviously we have to be safe, but I think the idea that the border is either completely closed or completely open isn't the paradigm anymore. I think we have to look at a risk-based approach, just like we look at everything else that goes back and forth across the border. It's all about managing risk and doing that in a smart way. And I think we're going to have to look at the movement of people in that way going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I know this is going to have to happen incrementally. There's not going to be an immediate reopening. There's going to have to be a movement that involves a bit of pedagogy about this and people feeling more at ease over a certain period of time. But it's true, in the long term, certainly the border closing is not in the interest of either country. And certainly some industries are very badly affected by it. I can think of one that's very obvious, tourism, right? So right now our hospitality is suffering quite a bit, certainly in a lot of the larger cities. And from our American neighbors as
that's CBP calling. They want to make sure you leave your Nexus card.
Yeah, no kidding, no kidding.
That's an obvious one. There are many, many others. I don't think we have the big picture, and we haven't seen sort of a detailed presentation of just how significantly the economic effects are of not seeing that cross-border movement between the two countries. I was in Niagara Falls, actually. I did some cross-border visiting, Quebec to Ontario. And you could see in Niagara Falls, even though on the Canadian side, it seems to be okay. You can see the sort of level of this sort of a degree of mistrust that informs you about the need for more pedagogy. Right on the American side, I went on the Maid of the Mist, which is now not called the Maid of the Mist on the Canadian side. Right, it's called the Hornblower, and they got the American side and the Canadian boat. And you may have seen there's some photos about this that I saw before doing this, and the photos showed the American boat more crowded, right? Not as much no real distancing in the Canadian boat. It's all distancing, which is a representation, maybe exaggerated or embellished to some extent, but I witnessed it firsthand. And that creates this feeling amongst Canadians that America is not taking care of itself the way we presumably are taking care of ourselves, and reflected in the case numbers. So underlying the border issue is another issue, which is very standout in our polling, which is the level of trust between Canadians and Americans. In our polling, I'm showing record low levels of trust on the part of Canadians towards Americans, somewhere in the 30% range. And that's consistent over the last 4 months. We've done 2 polls like this. We know that the level of trust in the Trump administration amongst Canadians is very, very low. And it is what it is. We have to respect the decisions of our neighbors, whatever that decision happens to be politically. But I do think the election could have a bearing on the way this evolves going forward, right? We'll have to see. The tone can change. The mood may change. It's hard to say. But those are issues I think that are also out there that we're not thinking about directly. But I think that's part of what we're waiting. And there's a bit of a wait and see around that as well.
What do you think about?
And the views, sorry, Ed, the views of Americans, we're not monolithic, right? So if you look at the state of New York, for example, the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, did a phenomenal job, is doing a phenomenal job with managing this health and humanitarian crisis, and the numbers are way down. So when I talk to A friend of Collins and mine, former Congressman John LaFalce.
Yes.
He's from Buffalo, New York, and he's got a place in Fort Erie. And he hasn't been, he goes every May to October, ever since he retired from Congress. He's got property there. He's not able to go across. If he were to attempt to go, he would be turned back to say, you're not going for business. Well, he's a retiree. New York has done very well. Upstate New York, the instances are very low. And yet, as Jack points out, there's a lack of trust. So I think it's important to dig beneath the surface and have honest conversations with each other about what the risks really are when we talk about a phased approach to reopening the border, whenever that is.
Yeah, and Ed, I would add to what Scotty's saying about risk management is that, we don't have to have all the border open at the same time. My sense is that we'd be smart to start small. Sweetgrass, Montana, and Coutts, Alberta, maybe in between Maine, St. Stephen, and Calais, for example, and see how that goes. Do it, as you say, Scotty, where the instances of local traffic are fairly low and where you can manage this, and that would, I think, start to build confidence for broader reopening. But remember, the border in Canada, the United States, is one of the longest in the absolute world. It's like going from Beijing to Moscow. It's 4.5 time zones, and I think sometimes we get caught up in kind of the European paradigm about border opening. We forget how big that border is, and it's not just one border; it's also the border between Alaska and Yukon. And of course, there are people on both sides of that border who would like to see that reopening because they're taking a different kind of view. And I think, as Scotty said earlier, some of the test and trace, and so there are things we should be looking to now. But as Jack's pointed out, that public education is not taking place, and it should. And I think both governments and business has a role here to play, because I do think public confidence, as Jack's pointing out, his polling, and certainly the polling I see, is not sufficient for any political leader on the Canadian side to want to move to an opening in the short term.
Scotty, I'm wondering, how would you characterize talks between Canada and the U.S. on when this might happen, or because, you don't just flip the switch. This is something you're going to have to lay out down the line, right? This is something that has to be planned at least 3 to 6 months down the line. How would you characterize those talks going on right now?
Well, the talks are happening. And what I would say is the Canadian ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman, is enormously talented. And she has all sorts of relationships inside the administration, inside the White House. I would say you're right that it's not flipping a switch, although the mutual decision to close that border was made in about 4 days. And Ambassador Hillman, and it was closing it, but keeping it open to essential commerce. And that was a pretty complicated dance, and it was done pretty quickly. So Ambassador Hillman and her team are in virtually constant conversations, but they get taken. Those conversations get taken over from time to time when things happen, like the U.S. decides to slap an aluminum tariff against Canadian aluminum products, and then so suddenly you've got to deal with that fire drill. Thankfully, that is no longer upon us, but there are developments like that occur, pretty regularly, that the embassy has to deal with, that the ambassador has to deal with, and another one in Congress is you have what's known as the National Defense Authorization Act that has a 100% content requirement for defense procurement, which is, as Colin and Jack know, and Ed, that's contrary to several generations of Canada-U.S. cooperation on defense procurement policy. So all this to say, the embassy has its hands full, but they engage on a daily basis, from my conversations with Hillman, with their counterparts, and with folks inside the White House.
Mary Scott Greenwood of the Canadian American Business Council joining us on Unpublished TV as well. Colin Robertson, he is a former Canadian diplomat as well as a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And Jack Jedwab is the president and CEO of the Association for Canadian Studies. And Jack, we're talking about only essential travel between the two, yet there was a story that came out this week. Uline owner Liz Uline gets through for a meeting to Toronto, spends 36 hours. There's fingers being pointed at the Canadian Border Services. Part of the problem, people don't understand who's essential, who's not. Is that part of the problem? Is we're getting mixed messages about this?
Yes and no. I think there are some exceptions. We don't understand fully where the exceptions are, and some people are able to find ways to get across the border. If you have a deceased relative, you're going to be able to get across the border to attend their funeral. That makes some sense. So there are all kinds of exceptions. People find ways. There's other stories about thousands of people trying to cross the Canada-U.S. border, land borders, and they didn't know that you couldn't cross our border. So, that cuts both ways. I don't think that's where the major issue is. We can find more stories like that, I'm sure. But that's not where the major issue is right now. The issues are the ones that, Scotty described and that Colin described earlier. But, again, overarching some of that, you can have a lot of good conversations between DHS and our border services people. But the politics and public opinion are really, really key right now. I don't think that with an election coming up, with the situation we're facing currently, maybe that election and the aftermath can serve as a catalyst to renew the political conversation, which of course is going on, at the embassy with Kirsten Hillman and various others, as Scotty pointed out. And then there's public opinion. And right now, again, we'll need a pedagogical process. It's going to take some time for public opinion to evolve. I've got some new polling, just got it today, in fact. Americans have very good opinions of Canadians. In fact, they have a more positive opinion, Americans, of Canadians than they have of Americans, which is interesting. Americans see us in all the Gallup polls that come out every February. You ask Americans who their best principal ally is. It's Canada. It's Canadians. What do you do when, your best friend doesn't trust you? I mean, that's happened to me, by the way, in my life on a micro level. But, here we're on a macro level, you don't trust your best friend doesn't trust you. It takes some time to work the problem out. And unfortunately, given what we're all living through right now, it's going to take some time for this thing to be fixed.
Colin,
Jack,
we trust you, Jack.
Donald Trump.
What's this? Donald Trump? Do I trust?
You got to stop hanging around with him. You're worried about your best friend trusting you or not. That's a
yeah. Now, Colin, I was going to say, now we're talking about the Canada-U.S. border, but we look around the world. There are other borders that are starting to open up between other countries. Do you see any of those that Canada-U.S. might take a look at, or is it because of the size of our two countries and the length of that border that we're a bit of a different thing altogether?
Well, I think we are different, but I come back to this idea of perhaps regional openings as we start to reopen. We should be looking at different models of what we could potentially do. The Europeans have done this. The Baltic states basically put a bubble around themselves and said, okay, within this bubble, we can move, but that keeps people out from Spain and Italy, for example. So I think that's the kind of thing we should be looking at. But I would make this point to Ed, that our border policy has been based on a kind of a two-legged stool up to now. It's been trade, and that's been trade since Confederation, and since 9/11, security. So we had these two pillars, and I think post-COVID we're going to add a third pillar, and that's going to be public health. I foresee that crossing borders now, in addition to your passport or Nexus card, you're going to have to travel, as we did when I was a kid, with your vaccine certificate, because I think that the public is going to expect a higher standard when it comes to their safety and public health as a consequence of this global pandemic. And that's not just true of Canadians. I think that's going to be true of other parts of the world as well.
Scotty, you had talked about contact testing and tracing as ways to reopen, or suggest. What other suggestions are you hearing on how to reopen or get this ball rolling to reopen?
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing that I have to say is the U.S. has to do a better job right here at home with dealing with this health crisis. And the better the job the U.S. does, the more confidence Canada will have. And
the Europeans too.
And that's right. But you see venues that are doing things to assist with hygiene. And so if you go to a store and you don't have a mask, they'll give you a mask at the door. So they've got someone checking, and they'll either turn you away or they'll give you a mask. And if you decline to wear it, then you get sent away. You also see places where the social distancing markings are on the ground. You've got hand sanitizing stations all over the place. You have contactless interactions that you see. I think airports are going more and more towards a contactless experience. I know they're piloting at the Vancouver airport, for example, just using your retina scan, like some technologies have, that becomes your identity check and your boarding pass and everything else. And if you can do that and minimize the interaction, so people are wearing masks, you've got sanitation, and you decrease the amount of times you have to actually physically touch something, whether it's a passport or a credit card or a boarding pass. All of those are the kinds of things that are going to be very helpful in terms of people are going to have to adapt the way they exist in public. And so this is the new normal. We can't just hope that it'll disappear overnight. We have to get cleaner and healthier and more accountable.
Yeah.
Jack, I wonder, do you see a time where it could be too late to reopen, or the damage would be done by the time it has been reopened?
No, not necessarily. And
No?
I've got to come back to Colin's point about the vaccine. I mean, even if and when the vaccine is provided and distributed, that's going to be a process that will take time. It's after that we'll need to do the pedagogy, because the situation is extremely fragile right now. I'll give you a very quick example. We've been in a deconfinement phase, right? And now we're seeing cases spike a bit. Some people feel it's a lot, some a bit. It only takes a few cases in one school to see the school shut down. And you take that on a sort of, again, that macro level, national level. If we did the pedagogy, did the contact tracing, did the things that Scotty's rightly suggesting we'll need to do, any small setback at this point in a situation as fragile as this, right, would make those efforts move in the opposite direction rather than the good one. So I think we're going to have to be sort of very good about the timing when we begin that pedagogy, and probably will be a bit closer to where we feel a vaccine is either pending or we've got the vaccine. That's not my preference, obviously. I want to go to the States. I want to visit my friends in Washington. I have friends there. Hey, and I'd like to meet Scotty in person as opposed to doing,
there you go.
Online. But that's probably the reality at this particular time.
Yeah, I think it's going to be.
The thing I would just say about the vaccine is, even when you have it, and God knows companies and scientists are working round the clock. They're sharing their libraries with each other. Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and all of these companies are really doing unprecedented levels of collaboration to try to get there. Once you get, and you're going to have several different kinds. And once you get through all of the trials and you ramp up production and you get it first to healthcare workers and then to seniors and at-risk populations, it's going to be a while before it's available to the general public. And even then, there's something called vaccine hesitancy. How many people are going to be willing? I mean, you have an anti-vaccination movement already in the United States, which personally to me, I think is troubling as a mom with school-age kids. I don't quite relate to the anti-vaxxer movement, if you will, although there are people that feel passionately about that. But there is a real concern when you see the President of the United States, with some of his crazy ideas, like maybe you should inject yourself with bleach, and then he's pushing that he's going to have a vaccine. He thinks he's one vaccine away from getting reelected. So there's all of this rhetoric. Everybody knows it's being rushed, it's being pushed. You can understand in that scenario how people would say, you know what, I'll wait to vaccinate my kids until I am sure that it's safe, until I know that it's been tested, till it's been around for a while, because I don't want some crazy startup version of a vaccine doing potential harm to my family. So the vaccine and this is even more true in Black and brown communities in the United States. The vaccine hesitancy is a real issue. And so we can't just pin our hopes on a vaccine as the answer to reopening the border. It's going to have to be a whole series of measures that we've discussed on this call.
No, I agree. But can I put a question to you and Colin once I've got the floor quickly here? Would you think that when the vaccine is generated, right, that when you cross the border, right, you got those boards at the airports can say, have you visited a farm in the last 10 days? Have you been to China in the last 2 weeks? have you taken the COVID-19 vaccine? Right? Do you think that that's something that governments will be doing at that particular point? In other words, they're saying, if you say you haven't taken the COVID-19 vaccine, you're not crossing the border, right? It could be one of the conditions for doing so. The anti-vaccine movement aside. In other words, is the government going to step in at some point and try to compel people to take the vaccine?
I think Canadian government would be likely to do so. Yes, Jack. I think that's quite feasible. You know, it's only been a couple of generations since we used to appear at a border with our vaccine certificates, and if you had the vaccine, you could get in. If you didn't, you couldn't. So I think this global pandemic is going to reintroduce, and I would say to those who have vaccine hesitancy, that's fine, but it is not a right to cross a border. It's a privilege. So if you don't have it, you're not going to be able to cross the border, and that will act as an incentive to those who have business and have to cross back and forth. Okay, Scotty and I both know it's like a Nexus card. Some people don't want to give their information away to get it. For me, I did it as soon as it was available. I would take the vaccine as soon as it was available for that very reason. But there will be some people who are not, and I think that there are going to be penalties now because of the public health risk of admitting someone who could be a spreader.
Well, folks, I want to thank you for joining us. Our time is up, and I want to thank our Unpublished TV
No
panel.
way.
Yes,
That
yes.
went by like that.
I know. Colin Robertson is a former Canadian diplomat, Vice President Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Mary Scotty Greenwood is the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council. And Jack Jedwab's the President and CEO of the Association of Canadian Studies. And coming up on our next Unpublished TV next Monday, we'll take a look at the throne speech and whether it sends us to the ballot box. Thanks for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.